13 Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 8. The Disaffected Station. I had spent an evening with my old schoolfellow Colm O'Dooling at his house out in Bray. He was an academic, a mathematician, and he worked in Trinity College, Dublin. It was my first time in the small, unassuming old house he and his wife had bought a few years previously. Now we were sitting in front of a comfortable coal and turf fire. "It must be a long commute in and out of town," I said, thinking of how far I had come out here. "Well, the dart made it possible," my companion said. "As you know, it was introduced in the 1980s as a commuter service to run along Dublin Bay from both sides into the city. So if you live anywhere along the dart line, even out here in Bray, you take it in and out of town each day, and it just becomes routine." He chuckled. "You wouldn't dream of coming home for lunch, of course." "You know," I said, "when my grandfather was a young family man in the 1920s, living in Dublin, he used to rent a house in Bray for the summer holidays, and they travelled there and back by train. It seems it was a major expedition. I heard the story from my father just recently. He tells me that every year on the appointed day they packed their trunks and took a taxi to Amiens Street Station. It was the only time they ever took a taxi," he said. "So the place that people like yourself now commute to used to be a place they went on their summer holidays." I shook my head in wonderment. "Well, there you are," O'Dooling said. "Times have changed, and it all has to do with speed, shrinking space, and time." "It was another world they lived in," I concurred. "Then again, when we were going to school, it was a different world too." We reminisced, as we inevitably did, about our old school days, and about boys we knew from our school and other schools in Dublin. "That was an intense time in our lives," I remarked. "And we remember it very well, don't we? I can remember things that happened as vividly as if they'd happened yesterday, don't you?" "Quite so," he nodded. "I even dream about being back there," I went on. "Sometimes I'm back in a class of young fellas, though I am somehow much older. Sometimes I have to pass an exam tomorrow and wonder whether I'll have the time to study." We remembered the rigours of a classical education, the learning of Latin, and how, in spite of everything, all the time and effort spent, it had largely evaporated. I told him I had used me Latin to read some old books when I was studying. He himself had never used any Latin since he left school. "But it was that way with so many subjects, wasn't it?" I said. "I was reading a statement in a book the other day to the effect that anyone over 40 hardly uses anything they had learned at school. Of course it's fashionable to say that kind of thing now. The idea is that the world is changing so fast that all knowledge becomes obsolete after a while, and we can never afford to stop learning." "Well, I dare say there's something in that," said O'Dooling. "When you think about how knowledge grows exponentially in a field like mine, I can hardly afford to take a year off. I have to keep up with the new publications." "And yet," I objected, "don't we still remember all kinds of things from school? I know I do. We remember the poems we learned at school. Why, I can even remember the appearance of the poem on the page of the school book. We could remember things like that vividly, intensely. What a shame it was that our education was not better planned, because everything we learned, whether worthwhile or not, was imprinted on us. It's all still there, somewhere, somehow. Childhood is a very vivid time, all right, O'Dooling said. That's what the psychologists say. Our brains are plastic then, and ready to learn whatever comes our way. Isn't that the general idea? Aye, I said, and what a shame it is that we can't go back and do it all over again. Maybe we could get it right this time, with the help of a few intelligent teachers who thought about what they were doing. But our childhoods are long over, and we can never get back that intense, vivid openness to learning that we once had. It didn't seem to matter what there was to learn. No, he said somewhat gloomily, it's all over. We got one shot at it. Another thing is that, although we remember vivid details, we also forget, I said. We forget how different the world was then. Dublin in the 1960s. God, that was so different. And yet, we think of the world we live in now as being not much different from what it was then. I certainly don't feel any different, said my companion. I'm still basically the same fellow I was when I was at school. It brings me back to the story I was telling you about me father taking the train for summer holidays in Bray, I said. We forget all too easily what the past was like and how different it was from the present. We forget what people's lives were like. We don't think much of what our own childhood worlds were like, but they're vanished. And yet some things don't change, which encourages the illusion. Dublin is still Dublin. The core of it is still there without a doubt. And Bray is no farther from Dublin today than it was in the 1920s, if you measured the railway line. O'Dooling said, you know, whether you're travelling on a train, or whether you're stopped in a station watching the train go by, your perceptions of time and distance are somewhat different. The theory of relativity started that way, he noted with a chuckle. The trouble with us is, we're travelling on a train rather than standing in a station. The pace of change is so fast. We're travelling into the future rather than waiting for it to happen to us. We're on the move in that sense, more than any previous generation. I nodded in agreement. The trouble is, I said, we're eager to move faster and faster into the future, getting ahead of ourselves, so to speak. But we pay little attention to the past we're leaving behind us, or have left far behind us. We forget how different things were in the past, and so it never occurs to us to go back and try tinkering with them, with a view to improving them, or reusing them. True enough, said O'Dooling, but of course, if we were to look back into the past, our past, the past we knew, or our grandparents knew, we'd have to accept all the disastrous mistakes that were made. We couldn't tinker with the past. It's all of a piece. Arrangements had been made for me to stay the night, due to the lateness of the hour. I had had a good night's sleep in the quiet house, and next morning I had left me old schoolfellow and his wife after a copious breakfast with good strong tea. Waiting on a dart into town at Bray Station, I was agreeably surprised to be able to board a comfortable commuter train instead, that had come up from further south somewhere. I settled myself to travel into the city centre. It wouldn't be crowded, and it wouldn't stop at every stop. We'd be into town smoother and quicker. The rail staff were attentive to their not very numerous complement of passengers, and every so often they came around and announced with a smile that the train would not be stopping at Harcourt Street Station, as it once did, but that we'd be heading straight into the city centre, Pearson Connolly. The smiles were fixed, and this seemed to be some kind of joke that they shared, either amongst themselves, or perhaps with the passengers too. But this was very strange. Everyone knew that there had been a Harcourt Street station, but it hadn't been used for 50 years. It was known as a landmark on Harcourt Street. I remembered it from my childhood, opposite the high school. And there was the old railway bridge still going over Hatch Street, but it hadn't served as a station within anyone's living memory. "So why are you telling us this?" I asked a black-haired man of about 40 in a conductor's dark blue uniform. "Just to make sure everybody knows," he said evasively, with the same indulgent smile. "But everyone does know," I said. "There's been no station and no train stopping there for generations." "Well, there you are," he said, still smiling. "It's a bit of history for you." I gave up my inquiries, because obviously there was some joke here I didn't get. But when I looked around at other passengers, some were frowning with puzzlement, though most seemed indifferent. The powerful diesel locomotive pulled the coaches along the usual dart route along the beautiful south side of Dublin Bay. There was Killiney and the green slope of the Vico Road. There was Dunleary and the harbour. We stopped down below the enclosing walls of the railway embankment. But after pulling out of Dunleary, we seemed to have left the coast and to be heading into the city. As this was going on, there was a lull in the movement inside the coaches, and things became rather quiet. The black-haired conductor came around again, and on seeing me, he seemed drawn to continuing our conversation. In fact, he sat down on a seat opposite me. "There's great railway history in and around Dublin," he chatted to me. "That, of course, was under the British, when the railways were built. There were several railway companies that divided up the country between them. There was wide gauge and there was narrow gauge. And of course there was the trams that ran on their own rails. Those were separate companies too. That was all in the days before Chorus Umper Airden," he laughed. "And in them days we hardly used to stop in Harcourt Street Station. It was mostly for the goods trains coming in from the country. But sometimes we stopped there on the way into Pearse Street and Amiens Street. That is, to Pearson Connolly as they are now. I still don't understand why all the fuss now today about Harcourt Street." "We tried to make it interesting for the passengers," he said, again somewhat evasively. "We like to remind them that there was once a place called Harcourt Street Station, and that we used to stop there." "Wasn't there a terrible crash there once?" I asked with sudden recollection. "Wasn't that why they closed it down?" He nodded. "Well," he said with a sigh, "in the year 1900 there was a goods train coming in that swerved onto another line to avoid another train that was standing on the main line when it shouldn't have been. He went into the wall of the station at full throttle, and begod, wasn't the locomotive hanging out through the broken wall of bricks, ready to fall down onto Hatch Street. Well, to be sure, they got more careful after that, but they still had the station and the line going further on across Hatch Street. It was finally closed down in the 1950s, but that was more for economy reasons. We still go through there sometimes. The rail lines are there, but there's no reason to stop there now." He looked out the window beside him and sighed again. "The history of Dublin is all around you," he reflected philosophically. "Indeed, it's not just gone. It intertwines with the present. and history has a great deal to tell us. We should always stay in touch with it. Never lose touch with the past. That's the mistake we make nowadays. We act as if the past no longer existed, as if it didn't make us what we are. He seemed to be warming to the subject. I noted with uneasiness. Look at education, he said, and I looked at him, startled. Look at what they learn in schools. Well, a lot of new stuff, and you would wonder if it's worth learning at all. And then think of the things they're not learning. Like Latin. I remember me Latin from school. Didn't you do Latin? And you probably a bit older than me. Indeed, and I did, I replied, somewhat flustered at the turn the conversation had taken. And do you remember it still? We took a lot of time on it. We had the time then. Things moved slower in them days. But of course, then Latin started to disappear. The Latin was gone out of the Mass that you heard on Sunday. Gone. Just like that. He snapped his fingers. Listen, he said, brightening. I'm glad to meet a fellow Latin scholar. Now, I have been working on a plan to revive Latin in all the schools. It can be done. It can still be done. The books are there. The teachers are still there. And Latin teaching could soon be put back on its feet. Where there's a will, there's a way. Sure, the adults, people like yourself and myself, could be persuaded to take up Latin again as a hobby, like playing the piano. There was a programme on the television a few years ago about just that. Older people that had had piano lessons in their youth rediscovering that they could play, rediscovering the enjoyment they could get out of it. Something like that you'd never forget. I looked perplexedly at him, trying to follow his argument. Listen, he said again, I have a whole plan developed to revive Latin in the schools. Come on for a minute into our compartment, and I'll show it to you. Curiouser and curiouser, I thought to myself, but I got up and followed him. He led me to a compartment further down the coach that was reserved for trained staff, although I hadn't suspected the existence of it. Inside, he took a bulging folder down from an overhead shelf and spread it out on the small table by the window. Look, he said, there it all is. A new curriculum for Latin in the country's schools. It makes use of the old books, but it makes the kids do more than just translate. It aims to get them reading, and then writing, and even speaking themselves. We pored over the pages of this curriculum. Indeed, it was all there. The parts of the language were all divided up into units, and each level of language skill was exercised by reading, not only from the classics, though they were there, but also St. Augustine and some of the medieval authors, and indeed continuing into comparatively modern times. I'm glad to see you have some of the modern authors there, I said, like Descartes and Linnaeus and fellas like that. That's what we missed at school. I mean, Latin was a thing with cobwebs, if you ask me. We did Julius Caesar and a book of the Aeneid, and God knows what else, but it was all from antiquity, fellas walking around the streets of Rome in togas. There wasn't a word about the fellas in the Middle Ages, or the humanists, or the modern fellas. And yet that was why we kept learning Latin for the past 2,000 years. Because it was useful. Because you wanted to write in it, to communicate with an audience beyond your own country. True for you. See, we had started to forget that Latin was a language, that people spoke it, and at least that they read it and wrote it, not agonising over it with a grammar and a dictionary, but fluently, like their own language. Begod, says I, the only time I heard Latin spoken was when the roll was called and we had to say, add some, or when the Latin teacher said something like, Claudite libros et tacete. True for you, says he again. The old grammars and dictionaries and textbooks are all still there, and the teachers are still there, though there's less and less of them as time goes by. What we need is to get the books out of the cupboards and blow the cobwebs off them. But then do something new with them. Teach the kids the mechanics of the language that they can use, writing sentences and paragraphs, and not just translating from line to line. Make Latin a living language. Do you think it could be done? I asked, getting involved in his world of enthusiasm in spite of myself. Do you think you'd ever get them to speak it and understand it spoken to them? Well, you were saying the teacher in your day used to say the odd thing in Latin. But there was a time when the whole class was in Latin. They were even supposed to speak Latin on the playground. And in universities and seminaries, from one end of Europe to the other, the lectures were in Latin, and they disputed in Latin. Heatedly, by all accounts. He chuckled at this recollection. Your plan sounds great, I said, but the reaction from the schools and from the public is easy enough to envisage, isn't it? They'll tell you you're mad. They'll say, fellas like you are just trying to turn back the clock. He looked at me thoughtfully for a moment. Then he said, but you can turn back the clock. You just have to get used to the idea. You can revive good things that have been forgotten. You can correct your mistakes from early on. You can make a new start and do it better this time. But it means turning back the clock, yeah. It can be done. Why just wind up the clock and let it run on without exploring all the possibilities? The clock turns backwards and forwards all right, if we only let it, or adjust it. Backwards and forwards, just like a train going up and down the line. He was looking at me very intensely, not knowing how to respond, if at all, and wishing just not to meet his gaze and read all of what was in it. I looked back over the curriculum. I could see how the pupils would be brought to read, to understand, to listen, to write, and even to speak. He'd put a lot of work into this. A lot of nights off, I thought darkly. So, he said finally, closing the folder, what do you think of that? It's very impressive indeed, I said. All I can do is wish you luck. Won't you be a part of it? He said, with sudden earnestness. I'm mounting a campaign. I'll need plenty of help from Latin scholars, whoever they are. Now it was my turn to be evasive. I would get involved and help you out, but I'm into a lot of other things at the moment. Harcourt Street, came the announcement over the public address system. Harcourt Street. We looked at one another in silence. Then he got up, and so did I, and we hurried outside into the interior of the coach. In spite of everything, there was a sense of inevitability as we pulled into Harcourt Street station. We were stopped on the main passenger line. The doors opened automatically. It seemed quiet outside. The conductor stepped out onto the platform and looked around him. Then he poked his head back into the coach and said to me, "Won't you step outside for a bit? Stretch your legs. We have a few minutes here." So I took him at his word and stepped outside onto the platform. It was a beautiful spring day. The old station seemed deserted of passengers, though there were a few workmen around. Across Harcourt Street I could hear bird song and the cackle of a magpie from the trees in the courtyard at the high school. There was surprisingly little traffic, though I heard the odd clip-clop of a cart horse's hooves. I suddenly remembered that I went by there every afternoon when I took the bus home after school. In them days, I could see the magpies walking jauntily across the courtyard. When the trees were bare, I could see the magpies had a stick nest up in what seemed to be the tallest tree. The conductor looked at me, smiling. He seemed to be very happy. Suddenly, I heard a chorus of boyish voices. I listened. They must have the classroom windows open over there, I thought. I listened to what they were chanting. It was Latin verbs. Amo, amas, amet, amamus, amatis, amant. Moneo, mones, monet, monemus, monetis, monent. Our eyes met. The conductor smiled beatifically, nodding his head in contentment in the direction of the chanting. Sum, esse, fui, facio, facere, feci, factum, audio, audire, audivi, auditum. The conductor and myself exchanged glances again, and again he smiled. But into his smile crept a touch of sadness, and he looked at me as if to say that what must be, must be. A new sound was to be heard now, the sound of a train with a head of steam approaching at full throttle. It was a sound I thought I had forgotten, though when I heard it I knew it, for I had heard it as a young boy in Amiens Street Station in the 1950s, when I went on a train for the first time with me mother. I don't remember very much from that journey. Them were the days when you could still take a train from Dublin to Derry through the North Midlands. We were going to visit her relatives up north. All I remember was that during the journey I was very much afraid of walking over the moving, shuttered plates linking the carriages. They seemed very insecure to me. No doubt I feared falling through them. But me mother had a bad headache during the journey, and she had to go to the restaurant car to get a cup of tea. She was one who suffered from migraines, so she persuaded me to come with her. It was indeed frightening. I couldn't have been more than 4 years old. But me mother got her cup of tea, and it seemed to do the trick for her. When we finally got back to our own carriage, she said I was an old star. So here was a steam train coming, and I could feel the vibrations in the track bed. The noise of the approaching train drowned out the sound of chanting from the boys in the high school as it got closer. I could now hear men shouting in alarm up and down the platform. A whistle blew shrilly, and the sound went through me. There was a grinding of points being shifted, and the other train went on to another line, missing our stationary train and surging past us. Then there was a great crash. As the locomotive hit the wall and the bricks crumbled. Like a hissing monster at its last gasp, the locomotive hung halfway between the station and Hatch Street. The shouting and screaming were worse now, above the hissing of the stricken locomotive. I was shaken, but the conductor had not moved. The hissing and the shouting of men slowly subsided, and again I could hear the hum of our diesel electric. It sounded like the train was gearing up to depart. The conductor motioned with one hand to the open door of the carriage. I got in. He followed me on board. The train door shut automatically. And I could feel the train move off. The backs of old houses were fast disappearing in a blur. Our eyes met again. On his face there was still the ghost of a smile. You have been listening to The Disaffected Station by Turlough Conmee from 13 Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.